Good morning. I'd like to first thank everyone for tuning in this morning and also thank the staff of the Maryland Historical Trust for once again providing us with this important forum, which I attend every year and always learn a great deal from. Today, my main proposition is fairly straightforward, that we as architectural fieldworkers should systematically investigate historic resources for old graffiti, inscriptions, and other markings, and that we should carefully document them, both for posterity and for further analysis. Rather than mere novelties or interesting conversation pieces, graffiti reveal all sorts of valuable information. They are a dispersed archive of humans interacting with the built environment that we seek to study, understand, and preserve, and they can thus provide critical clues about the historical uses of the buildings where they're found. Collectively, they can also reveal interesting patterns that shed light on historical human behavior and on American culture. This talk will feature just a few examples of Maryland graffiti, highlighting some patterns I've witnessed more broadly, and to suggest possible areas of significance and interpretation of similar markings. My dissertation research over the last 7 years has included extensive fieldwork to discover what markings can be found on historic buildings, from houses to churches to barns and more. I've now documented thousands of historical graffiti and hundreds of old buildings across much of the East Coast, from Maine to Florida. So I thought it would be useful, especially at a symposium dedicated to fieldwork, to first touch quickly on my basic methodology, how I find and record all of these graffiti. For each site I document, I first learn as much as I can about the history of the building and its architectural fabric. Knowing the periodization of the building is important, since it helps me understand the earliest possible time the markings might have been made in various parts of that building. This is the idea of terminus post quem, which is used especially in archaeology. Where to look for graffiti, on the inside or outside of a structure, can be dependent on the building type. Houses show different patterns from church buildings, which are quite different from barns. But the most important rule of thumb is to search at reasonably convenient heights for writing, to envision where you might easily write or carve if you were standing or sitting near a surface. In darker buildings like barns or dark rooms like attics, I find the most graffiti in the areas that are illuminated by natural sunlight, since their creators preferred to be able to see their work as they created it. On building exteriors, doorways tend to attract a lot of graffiti activity, as did areas where people congregated, stood, hid, or sat for long periods of time. When documenting building interiors, I use a variety of lights to closely examine every exposed surface, recording as much as possible on measured or schematic floor plan drawings. This is where doing research before I go to these sites comes in handy. Many sites already have floor plans, but if not, I make quick sketches of the overall plan. On these, I note the location of the more elaborate or significant markings, and at every site, I photograph all of the markings that I discover, every single initial or even incomplete image. Photographing old graffiti is tricky since its legibility tends to be challenging. Penknife carvings are often only lightly scratched or left unfinished, chalk fades, and pencil graffiti can be very faint or smudged. So lots of light and experimenting with various angles of lighting is key. Also challenging, once graffiti is recorded, is interpreting its meaning, its context, and significance. Since so much graffiti is anonymous, and thus especially difficult to research and contextualize, we must often rely on patterns to arrive at informed conclusions. The approach of my dissertation has been to document as much graffiti as possible, looking for repetitions in content, locations, and age, and deciphering what those patterns tell us, and shedding more light on the meaning of individual examples. Yet sometimes the markings at a site will tell their own individual story, even if they do reflect some larger patterns. My first case study is an example of exterior inscription, which might only be considered graffiti in the most technical sense, in that it involves informal writing on a wall. But its markings are of a type that can be found on many brick houses and buildings throughout Maryland and the Mid-Atlantic. The Mercer Brown House in Calvert, Maryland is fascinating to me because both the house and its markings embody an entire Quaker community. Despite its name, the Mercer Brown House is an architectural monument to far more than just one person. Hinting at a local network of involved contributors, a close examination of the structure reveals many hand-carved markings and inscriptions, including names, initials, dates, and symbols, mostly created in 1746, when the original portion of the house was built. Though not to scale and a bit rudimentary, this sketch map of the area, drawn in the 1960s by a local historian, affords us a helpful bird's-eye view of the Brown House's community of inscribers, with a Quaker meeting house, which they called the Brick Meeting House, at its focal point. The most prominent marked object embedded in the walls of the Brown House is the large, elaborate date stone above the original front entryway. The plaque is skillfully carved from slate or siltstone, and it contains Hannah and Mercer Brown's initials, the Latin words Anno Domini, meaning the year of our Lord, the year 1746, and several decorative flourishes. Compared to this elaborate date stone of the owners, the other markings at the house, signed in brick, are smaller, more rudimentary, and obviously secondary. However, that the Browns allowed and probably encouraged these very public signatures on their beautiful new brick house shows the importance of their Quaker neighbors to the Browns and to their dwelling. For example, to the upper left of the main door, a brick is inscribed with the initials JD, flanking a circular symbol. This signature almost certainly can be attributed to John Day. Day was a local tanner who settled in the area in 1739, and the plaster walls in the Brown House, and maybe some of the brick mortar, probably included cattle or horsehair from Day's nearby tan yard. Most of the other signature bricks are on the side of the house, closest to the road, near the corner that was probably the most visible to passersby. About waist high is a brick that reads JB 1746 with a diamond in between. This was almost certainly carved by Jeremiah Brown, Mercer's second cousin. Jeremiah had recently built a grist mill and a sawmill nearby. Jeremiah's surviving house, built 11 years after his cousin Mercer's, also features carved names of some of its builders, including Jeremiah Brown himself, who scribed this date stone set near the doorway. It's interesting to compare the markings at the two Brown houses, which seems to solidify the conclusion that it was Jeremiah Brown who signed his second cousin's house. Given that he was a relative and that he owned a sawmill, Jeremiah's likely contribution to building his cousin's house is quite clear. Another brick, higher up on the southwest corner, features the initials WW. This is likely an inscription of William White, who was a mason in the area. White is, in fact, recorded on a bill of sale for, quote, burning and setting bricks for the Brown House. There's another brick with the letters SE, also with a diamond in the middle. This inscription can be attributed to a neighbor, Samuel England, who grew up just a half mile or so to the south. England had sold 500 bricks to Mercer Brown for the construction of his house. Just above Jeremiah Brown's brick, B. Chan is visible on the west wall, but around the corner, on the end of the same brick, are the letters LEE. This is the wraparound signature of Benjamin Chandley Jr. There's speculation that Chandley carved the Brown's date stone, since he was a well-known local clockmaker with the tools and skills for precise engraving. His house, like several of the others, was also probably within eyesight of the Brown's house. Time won't allow a discussion of some of the other markings at this house in connections with other Quaker neighbors, but as these inscriptions alone show, even though marking is often the act of an individual, the practice can also be a collective one, conveying powerful messages about specific cultural groups at defined points in time. Since these inscriptions were likely carved around the same time, the marking of the building was a communal act, even rising perhaps to the level of ritual. And the signatures collectively symbolize Calvert's strong Quaker community that came together to build a single house in 1746. You may have noticed on John Day's brick, between the letters J and D, a circular symbol with a six-lobed star or six-petaled flower in the middle. It's a little difficult to make out since the lime mortar that originally filled the inscription to make it more visible has partially flaked away over the centuries. But this is a nice segue into the second theme for today. At the Beatty Kramer house in Frederick, Maryland, the framing in the attic contains a similar star or flower symbol, often called a daisy wheel, as well as what looks like an eye, possibly a version of the evil eye found in several cultures. These mysterious symbols are not unlike similar ones that can be found in many pre-Civil War era buildings, but their meanings are up for debate. The most common explanation is that they are part of a class of spiritual protective graffiti called apotropeia, meaning evil averting. Scholars have long demonstrated that early Americans often synthesized mainstream religion with traditional folk beliefs, including popular magic, and attempts to navigate and influence their daily lives. And during organized surveys of medieval graffiti in England, thousands of these circular, compass-drawn symbols, called daisy wheels, hexafoils, rosettes, or six-petaled stars, have been discovered on architectural surfaces, especially in the interiors of medieval churches and on houses. The daisy wheel symbol, which can be traced back to at least the 6th century, has been long associated with attempts to avert witchcraft and other misfortune, and may have generally been considered a good luck charm. Even with scant documentary evidence to explain their meaning, researchers point to the locations and the contexts in which these symbols are found, which often suggest that they might have been created with magical or apotropaic intent. Many markings and inscriptions discovered inside 18th and 19th century buildings in the eastern US are also suggestive of possible efforts at spiritual fortification. For example, they are frequently found around fireplaces, openings that were believed to be vulnerable to intrusion by malevolent spirits from outside. By animating the material fabric of their buildings with text, symbols, and other markings, some men and women likely attempted to transform their houses, churches, and even barns into active agents of sanctuary and refuge, crafting a sort of liminal, vibrant, material shell between the interior and exterior, the visible and the invisible, and the sanctified and unsanctified. Yet the extent of these practices and their various forms of expression need much further documentation and study. People tend to quickly assume such markings are apotropaic, when that often might not be the case at all. In Washington, D.C., the attic of the Stephen Decatur House, a federal-style brick mansion built across the street from the White House in 1818, contains a similar combination of markings as the Beatty Kramer House. A large timber post features a daisy wheel with a deliberate X cut through it. Directly across from the daisy wheel, another post is marked with a unique compass-drawn symbol, again, possibly a variant of a providential or evil eye. This symbol consists of a large pair of conjoined circles with an added flourish to create an eye in the overlapping section. These suggestive markings are located above the central axis of the house, over the front door and the stairways, perhaps to provide protection over the heart of the dwelling. And these markings are even more intriguing when considering an inscribed brick that was laid into an exterior wall, which appears to feature a devil, a key, and a Christian cross. There are a few biblical passages that this brick might even be invoking, and so it seems possible that the inscription was another attempt to bless the house and perhaps drive away misfortune. Yet some people argue that daisy wheels and other compass-drawn shapes were not apotropaic at all, but the work of carpenters, usually as they calculated the geometry of building frames. And there are cases where this seems very plausible. For example, if we look at this illustration in Asher Benjamin's 1798 Builder's Guide, The Country Builder's Assistant, a compass-drawn diagram for calculating roof pitches bears a striking similarity to some compass-drawn symbols I've seen in many buildings. This includes the Decatur House's evil eye, which, minus the addition of the central eye motif, is very similar to Benjamin's illustration if we flip it horizontally. At the Woodlands in Philadelphia, I found an almost identical version of Benjamin's illustration among a collection of other various compass-drawn circles. This one even includes the diagonal X's present in the Builder's Guide. In that same room, the master builder of the Woodlands, John Child, signed his name in pencil, suggesting that he or other builders may have been beside the other markings in the room as well. Yet at the Beatty Kramer House, why did someone draw only the eye-shaped middle portion of the symbol, the same part that was apparently made to look like an eyeball in the Decatur House example? This almond shape in the middle is sometimes called the vesica piscis, and among other things, its point is used for the top of Gothic-styled lancet windows. But there are no Gothic details in either of these buildings or any obvious design elements that would use this shape. Of course, we must consider the possibility that some of these markings could also be simply whimsical or playful doodles, the spirographs of the 18th and 19th centuries. In Massachusetts, for example, a restoration carpenter showed me this section of a feather-edged board wall that he removed and preserved from a house built around 1750. It features about 7 compass-drawn circular symbols, elaborate designs, that could easily be ascribed by some to some sort of apotropaic effort, but which I suspect were created for fun or for decoration, perhaps by a bored teenager. I've seen similar combinations of compass-drawn doodles at several other sites in the Mid-Atlantic. Still, the locations and context of many daisy wheels and related markings make construction geometry or playful doodles seem like unlikely explanations for them. And it is almost a certainty that some of these inscribed marks are protective in intent. It is still unclear how the meaning of daisy wheels and their use may have evolved over time, especially in the 19th century, and whether they were slowly stripped of their magical meaning in favor of good luck symbolism or even just whimsical fun. So we must be careful when interpreting these circular markings in old buildings. But whether playful or quite serious in their intent, they inscribe significant stories into the building surfaces where they're found. Just steps from the Maryland State House, the William Slicer House on Fleet Street features old weatherboard siding with several ships carved into it. This is perhaps unsurprising considering Annapolis's maritime associations and with the Naval Academy just a few blocks away. Similarly, the Whaley Granary, located in a farm complex in Berlin, Maryland, just a couple of miles from the Atlantic Ocean, also contains drawings of several ships, carefully recorded on measured drawings by a team from the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation in the 1980s. Both of these examples are part of a fascinating phenomenon that I've documented across the Atlantic seaboard, to the point where some people have suggested my dissertation should focus solely on graffiti of ships. And that's because ship graffiti is prolific. I have now identified over 60 early American buildings with graffiti of ships, boats, and schooners, and I've documented hundreds of ship graffiti. I suggest that these graffiti hint at a widespread but little explored veneration of ships as objects, common in coastal communities during the 18th and 19th centuries. Consider, for example, the memoirs of whaler Thomas Nickerson from Nantucket Island in Massachusetts. Recalling his excitement upon first boarding the fated whale ship Essex in 1817, which inspired the story of Moby Dick, Nickerson, one of the few survivors of its doomed voyage, still remembered it as, quote, the most pleasing moment of my life. Like most young men in Nantucket, he had been raised, as he put it, to idolize the form of a ship. To me, two words in the statement are particularly striking. First, idolize, which means to revere, worship, love greatly or excessively, and form, defined as the visible shape or configuration of something. To paraphrase Nickerson then, he and his contemporaries grew up revering the designs of ships, a telling statement revealing an affection for ships as visual icons along their shores. Nickerson's vivid memories help us better understand the excitement that led so many young men, especially those exposed to the coastal trades, to carve the form of a ship into the wood surfaces in mid-Atlantic barns, church pews, and even window panes of houses. These nautical images demonstrate not only the powerful presence of ships in their daily lives, but also the freedoms that those ships represented, especially from the day-to-day routines of provincial life. Drawing these ships was also a way of possessing them in a way that the inscriber could not in reality. While etching a ship with his penknife, a young man built its hull, worked its rigging, set its sails, and propelled her in motion through space and time. The artist's imagination could board the vessel and be whisked away to distant lands to encourage romantic and even dangerous adventures. With so many maritime communities in Maryland, I suspect there are countless historic buildings in its coastal areas that feature such nautical folk art just waiting to be documented. And in fact, just as I was preparing to record this presentation, I received an email with this photo of a schooner graffito drawn on a plaster wall of an old general store, probably dating to the late 19th century, at a farm complex in Dorchester County, Maryland, near the Honga River in the Chesapeake Bay. So to wrap up, I was really only able to scratch the surface today regarding the wide variety of historical graffiti to be discovered on mid-Atlantic buildings. While ships are fascinating to discover and the possibility of apotropaic markings is intriguing to consider, just simple names or initials inscribed on a building, especially when they contain a date, record a brief chapter of that structure's past and provide valuable information about the people who interacted with the site. And all sorts of other information is waiting to be discovered, recorded, and considered on the plaster walls, exterior brickwork, church pews, window panes, wood siding, attic beams, and barn doors of Maryland's historic structures. When people carved words and images with penknives into walls, they recorded things that were present around them, but they also revealed what was on their minds at the time. In this way, we can reconstruct the living worlds that surrounded the static historic properties that we study. By searching for and documenting the written traces that people left behind as they interacted with their built environment, we can reconstruct them working, thinking, playing, imagining, and often simply longing to be remembered. Old graffiti are valuable historical documents, even if fragmentary and messy, but they are particularly vulnerable documents because they are not protected in an archive, and they are subject to the weather, wear and tear, and remodeling campaigns. As such, I believe we should make a systematic effort to find and record this dispersed archive while we still can. Thank you.